60 years before Columbus was born, the greatest fleet the world had ever seen departed China. Over 300 ships carrying 28,000 men sailed into the morning mist of the Indian Ocean, their silk banners snapping in the wind, their treasure ships rising from the water like floating palaces. At their head sailed a vessel that dwarfed anything Europe would build for centuries. 400 feet of carved teak and iron, 9 masts piercing the sky, a crew of hundreds moving across its decks like ants on a mountain. The man who commanded this armada was a Muslim eunuch named Zheng He, and he would sail 30,000 miles across the known world before his story was deliberately erased from history. What followed was the most extraordinary maritime achievement in human history and its most tragic abandonment. My primary source for this narrative is Lavathes's When China Ruled the Seas, supplemented by primary Chinese chronicles and the remarkable inscriptions Zheng He himself erected during his voyages. The Taizong Shilu and other Ming court records provide the official perspective, while Ibn Battuta's earlier travels and Portuguese accounts from a generation later help us understand what Zheng He encountered. We walk in the footsteps of a man who left monuments across 3 continents, but whose personal voice has been largely silenced by time. The boy who would become history's greatest admiral was born Ma He in 1371, in the mountain province of Yunnan, where China's southwestern border dissolved into the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. This was not truly China yet. It remained the last stronghold of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Empire that had ruled China for a century before being driven north by the rising Ming. Here, in the valleys where Muslim traders had settled generations before, where the scent of spices mixed with mountain pine and the call to prayer echoed off Buddhist temples, a child grew up hearing stories of worlds beyond the Middle Kingdom. His grandfather had made the Hajj to Mecca. His father had traveled the Central Asian routes where silk and silver changed hands in bazaars that spoke a dozen languages. The family name was Ma, a Chinese adaptation of Muhammad, marking them as Hui, Chinese Muslims whose ancestors had followed the Mongol conquests eastward centuries before. Young Ma He learned Arabic alongside Chinese, heard tales of distant seas alongside Confucian classics, and absorbed the restless energy of a borderland where civilizations met and merged. The world of his childhood smelled of cardamom and jasmine, of incense from the temples and wood smoke from the villages tucked into hillsides green as jade. The Yunnan Plateau stretched in all directions, its valleys fertile with rice, and its mountains hiding silver mines that had made this region wealthy enough to resist Chinese conquest. Here the monsoons brought life, torrential rains that turned the landscape emerald and fed the great rivers flowing south toward Burma and Vietnam. It was a world that bred travelers, where horizons called to young men, and every merchant's tale spoke of fortune waiting beyond the next mountain pass. But in 1381, when Ma He was 10 years old, the Ming dynasty's armies arrived to claim what remained of Mongol China. The war was brief and brutal. General Fu Yud led 30,000 troops into Yunnan, cutting through mountain passes the Mongols had held for decades. At Lake Dian, near the provincial capital, the final battle raged for 3 days. Ma He's father fought with the Mongol forces. Muslims often served in their armies, valued for their loyalty and their connections to the trading networks that funded warfare. When the Ming banners rose over the battlefield, he lay among the dead, his blood seeping into soil that would now serve new masters. 10-year-old Ma. He was captured with hundreds of other boys. What happened next was standard policy for the Ming dynasty when claiming new territory, a policy designed to transform enemies into servants, to break the old order so completely that resistance became impossible. The boys were castrated. The procedure was performed without anesthesia in a small, stifling room that reeked of blood and fear. A blade severed everything. Then a metal tube was inserted to keep the urethra open while the wound healed. Most victims were kept conscious throughout. Unconsciousness meant death. Boiling oil cauterized the wounds. Those who survived the first 3 days without urinating died of internal poisoning. Those who survived a week might live. Perhaps 7 boys in 10 saw another month. He lived. The wound healed badly, leaving scars he would carry forever, but he lived. And in living, he entered that strange third gender of Chinese society, the eunuchs, men unmade and remade to serve the imperial household. They could rise to heights of power impossible for whole men precisely because they could never found rival dynasties, never threaten the imperial bloodline. They were trusted because they had sacrificed everything. The scarred boy was given to Prince Zheng He, 4th son of the Ming founding emperor, a man destined for frontier command rather than the throne. The prince was only 21, ambitious and capable, tasked with holding the northern border against Mongol raids. His household was military rather than ceremonial, a place where a bright boy could learn the arts of war alongside the protocols of court service. He grew tall in that household. Unusually tall for any Chinese man, extraordinarily so for a eunuch. Contemporary accounts describe him as towering, perhaps over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and a voice that could carry across a battlefield. His presence commanded attention in ways that defied every stereotype of castrated men. When he entered a room, conversation stopped. When he spoke, people listened. The prince took notice. This was no ordinary eunuch, content to manage household affairs and court gossip. He had inherited his father's understanding of military logistics, his grandfather's gift for languages, and something entirely his own, a capacity for leadership that seemed to expand to fill any vessel that contained it. He learned to read the weather and cloud formations, to calculate supply requirements for armies on the march, to negotiate with tribal chieftains who measured worth by the straightness of a man's spine and the steadiness of his gaze. For 18 years he served Prince Zheng He on the northern frontier. He fought Mongol raiders in valleys where his father might once have traveled peacefully. He organized supply trains across distances that would have challenged Roman legions. He learned to speak Mongolian and Tibetan, Arabic and Persian, the dozen dialects that echoed through frontier markets. Most importantly, he learned to read his master's mind, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to solve problems before they became crises, to embody the prince's will so completely that subordinates obeyed him as they would obey Zheng He himself. He was no longer the terrified boy who had been castrated in Yunnan. He had become something unprecedented. A eunuch general, a Muslim commander in service to a Chinese prince, a man who had lost everything and gained power beyond most men's dreams. In 1398, everything changed again. The founding Ming emperor died, and his chosen successor was not one of his many sons but his grandson, a scholarly young man who immediately began stripping power from his uncles. The new emperor saw the princes as threats to his authority. He began recalling their armies, removing their supporters, and making it clear that the old arrangements would not survive his reign. Prince Zheng He faced a choice that would define the rest of his life: submit to probable execution or raise the banner of rebellion against his own nephew. He chose war. The Jingnan campaign, the campaign to clear away disturbance, began in 1399 and raged for 3 years across northern China. It was civil war of the most vicious kind, where former comrades faced each other across battle lines, and every engagement carried the weight of dynasty and legitimacy. Zheng He's northern armies, hardened by decades of frontier warfare, marched south against forces loyal to the young emperor. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Prisoners were executed without mercy. The countryside bled. He rode beside his master through every campaign. At the siege of Zhenglunba, when imperial forces nearly surrounded the prince's army, He's tactical brilliance may have saved the rebellion from destruction. He identified the weak point in the enemy line, concentrated Zheng He's best troops for a breakthrough, and led the charge himself. A eunuch general with a curved sword in his hand and a voice that cut through battle din like thunder. The sight became legend among Zheng He's followers, their master's most trusted servant. The tall Muslim who had been broken as a boy and reforged as a weapon, standing in his stirrups as the enemy arrows whistled past, pointing the way to victory with a blade that caught the morning sun. Men followed him who would never have followed an ordinary eunuch. They had seen him bleed. They had heard him pray. They knew that everything he was belonged to Prince Zheng He, and that devotion made him incandescent. In 1402, Zheng He's forces captured the imperial capital. The young emperor vanished in the flames that consumed his palace, dead, fled, or hidden. No one knew for certain. Zheng He ascended the dragon throne as the Yongle Emperor, one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history. His first act was to reward those who had made his victory possible. The eunuch who had served him for over 20 years, who had shared every hardship and risked every battle, received more than gold or titles. He received a new name, Zheng He of Zheng, honoring a place where his military service had saved the rebellion. More significantly, he received a commission that would have seemed impossible years before. The Yongle Emperor would build the greatest fleet in human history, and his former slave would command it. The decision emerged from the intersection of ambition, insecurity, and vision that defined the early Ming dynasty. Zheng He was a usurper who had overthrown his own nephew, a fact that would shadow his entire reign. He needed to demonstrate that heaven approved of his rule, that the mandate of heaven had passed from the vanished emperor to himself. What better proof than tribute from the ends of the earth? Foreign kings bowing before the dragon throne, exotic gifts flowing into the imperial treasury, acknowledgement from distant peoples that China stood at the center of the world's order. But the emperor's vision extended beyond legitimacy. China in 1405 was genuinely the most advanced civilization on Earth. Its population approached 100 million, larger than all of Europe. Its cities dwarfed London or Paris. Its technology, printing, gunpowder, metallurgy, navigation exceeded anything available in the West. Its agricultural techniques supported population densities that European observers would find incredible. Its bureaucracy, selected through competitive examinations, administered territories larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. Why should such a civilization remain ignorant of the wider world? Why should Chinese knowledge of geography end at the South China Sea? Why should the tribute system, the careful network of diplomatic relationships that acknowledge Chinese supremacy, remain limited to immediate neighbors? The Yongle Emperor envisioned something unprecedented. Chinese fleets sailing to every corner of the known world, establishing diplomatic relations with every significant kingdom, creating a global order with China at its center. It was a vision that would require unprecedented resources, unmatched organizational skill, and a commander capable of representing Chinese power across cultures and continents. The emperor chose the man who had never failed him, whose loyalty was absolute, whose capabilities seemed to expand with every challenge. Zheng He accepted the commission knowing it would define the rest of his life. At 34, he was no longer young by the standards of his era, but he possessed something that could not be taught: the absolute confidence of an emperor who trusted him with the greatest enterprise in Chinese history. The boy who had lost everything in Yunnan had gained something beyond price: the chance to sail farther than any Chinese admiral before him, to plant Chinese banners on shores no Chinese had ever seen, to write his name in the chronicles of the world. The preparations began immediately. In shipyards along the Yangtze River, the greatest naval construction project in history took shape. The treasure ships, Baoquan, rose from the water like floating cities. The largest may have stretched over 400 feet from bow to stern, their 9 masts towering above everything else in the harbor, their holds capacious enough to carry hundreds of men and months of supplies. Even conservative estimates suggest these vessels dwarfed anything Europeans would build for centuries. Columbus's Santa Maria, the ship that would carry him to the Americas 90 years later, was perhaps 1/5 their size. But the treasure ships were only the beginning. The full fleet would comprise over 300 vessels of various types: horse ships for transporting cavalry, supply vessels for food and water, troop transports for the soldiers who would provide military backing, and warships armed with the latest Chinese military technology, cannons, rockets, gunpowder bombs, and firearms that existed nowhere else in the world. The human requirements were staggering. 28,000 men would sail with the first expedition. Sailors and soldiers, navigators and interpreters, doctors and scribes, merchants and administrators. They would speak dozens of languages, Arabic and Persian for the Muslim trading networks, Tamil and Sanskrit for the Indian kingdoms, Javanese and Malay for the Southeast Asian ports. They would carry gifts worth fortunes, silk and porcelain, gold and silver, lacquerware and tea designed to demonstrate Chinese wealth and sophistication to foreign courts. Most remarkably, they would carry live animals. Chinese naval logistics had advanced far enough to transport horses across thousands of miles of ocean, landing cavalry forces on foreign shores to demonstrate Chinese military capabilities. The ships included veterinarians, grooms, and specialized compartments designed to keep livestock healthy during voyages that might last 2 years. The fleet even maintained gardens, sprouting soybeans and growing vegetables aboard ship. Chinese naval medicine had conquered scurvy centuries before European sailors learned to carry limes. The death rates that devastated European exploration, 30, 40, 50% casualties from disease and malnutrition, were largely unknown to Chinese expeditions. Zheng He's fleets were floating cities engineered for survival. By 1405, everything was ready. The treasure ships rode at anchor in the Yangtze, their holds packed with supplies, their crews trained and equipped, their commander standing on the flagship's deck as the morning mist lifted from the river. Zheng He was now in his prime, a tall figure in silk robes, his voice carrying across the water as he gave final orders, his presence commanding absolute attention from 28,000 men who would follow him into unknown seas. The departure from Nanjing became ceremony and spectacle. Buddhist monks chanted blessings for a safe voyage. Taoist priests consulted the stars for auspicious timing. Islamic prayers rose from the Muslim members of the crew, including their admiral, who had never forgotten the faith of his childhood despite decades in Chinese service. Imperial officials delivered final messages from the emperor. Families gathered on the riverbank to watch their sons and husbands sail toward horizons that might never bring them home. When the anchors rose and the great fleet began to move, the sight defied comprehension. 300 vessels stretching as far as the eye could see, their sails catching the wind like clouds descended to earth, their passage stirring the river into foam that sparkled in the morning sun. The treasure ships dominated everything, floating palaces whose masts scraped the sky, whose bulk displaced water like small islands, whose very existence declared Chinese power to anyone with eyes to see. Zheng He stood on his flagship's highest deck, watching the Chinese coast slip away behind them. He was leaving the world he had known for 34 years, sailing toward waters no Chinese admiral had ever explored, carrying the hopes and ambitions of the world's greatest empire, everything he had learned. The languages of Central Asia, the logistics of frontier warfare, the diplomatic skills acquired in a dozen campaigns would now be tested against challenges he could hardly imagine. Behind him lay the Yangtze River, the forbidden city under construction, the emperor who had raised him from slavery to command. Ahead lay the South China Sea, the straits of Southeast Asia, the trading ports of the Indian Ocean, and peoples who had never heard of China or seen ships like the ones now bearing down on their harbors. The first voyage of Zheng He had begun. The world would never be the same. The South China Sea stretched before them like hammered silver, its surface broken only by the wakes of 300 ships moving in formation across waters that had carried Chinese junks for centuries. But never like this. Never with such purpose, such scale, such audacious ambition. As the coast of China faded into morning haze, Zheng He's fleet entered waters that would test every assumption about what was possible on the open ocean. The treasure ships moved with surprising grace for vessels of their size. Chinese naval architecture had solved problems that would puzzle European shipbuilders for generations. how to create hulls strong enough to withstand oceanic swells, how to distribute weight across multiple compartments, how to design rudder systems capable of steering vessels longer than city blocks. The largest ships rode the swells like floating mountains, their motion stately and deliberate, while smaller vessels darted between them like dolphins around whales. From his flagship's deck, Zheng He could observe the entire armada spread across miles of ocean. The sight never failed to stir something deep in his chest. Not pride exactly, but a kind of awe at the magnitude of what the emperor had entrusted to his command. Each ship represented months of labor, fortunes in materials, dozens of lives depending on his decisions. The weight of that responsibility had settled into his bones during the months of preparation, but out here, with nothing but water to the horizon, it pressed against him like a physical force. The crew of his flagship numbered over 400 men, representing every province of the empire. Forward, near the bow, Muslim sailors from the western provinces worked alongside Buddhist monks whose prayers ensured favorable winds. Midships, Confucian scholars maintained detailed logs of their progress, while Taoist navigators consulted star charts and magnetic compasses. The stern quarters housed interpreters fluent in a dozen languages, their skills essential for the diplomatic encounters that lay ahead. This diversity was deliberate. The fleet carried not just Chinese power, but Chinese inclusiveness, demonstrating that the Middle Kingdom welcomed all who acknowledged its supremacy. Navigation across these distances required techniques unknown in Europe. Chinese sailors had perfected the use of magnetic compasses centuries before Europeans learned to trust them. More remarkably, they navigated by detailed star charts that mapped celestial positions across different latitudes. As the fleet moved south, familiar constellations disappeared below the horizon while new stars emerged, a transformation that marked their passage into genuinely foreign skies. The navigators tracked these changes meticulously, creating records that future expeditions would depend upon. But the most sophisticated navigation tool was Zheng He himself. His memory contained the accumulated wisdom of Chinese maritime experience, wind patterns and current flows, the seasonal rhythms of monsoons, the locations of reefs and safe harbors reported by generations of merchant captains. More crucially, he understood the human geography of the seas they were crossing. Every major port from Malacca to Ceylon maintained communities of Chinese traders, men who had married local women and learned local customs while maintaining connections to the homeland. These overseas Chinese would serve as interpreters, guides, and intelligence sources throughout the voyage. Their first destination lay 2 weeks south, the great trading port of Malacca, gateway to the straits that connected the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. The choice was strategic. Malacca controlled the narrow waterway through which all trade between China and India had to pass. Its rulers collected tribute from every merchant vessel. Its markets overflowed with goods from across Southeast Asia. Its political allegiances could determine whether Chinese trade flourished or withered. If Zheng He could establish Chinese influence here, every subsequent achievement would build on that foundation. As the fleet sailed south, the weather began to change. The temperate climate of northern China gave way to tropical heat that penetrated even the largest ship's multiple decks. The air grew thick with moisture that made silk robes cling to skin and turned metal fittings hot to the touch. Crew members accustomed to the dry cold of Beijing found themselves struggling with humidity that sapped energy and made simple tasks exhausting. Yet the ship's ventilation systems, another Chinese innovation, drew cooling breezes through even the lowest compartments, making conditions bearable where European vessels would have become floating ovens. The sea itself transformed as they moved south. The relatively shallow waters of the South China Sea revealed themselves in shifting shades of blue and green, with coral reefs appearing beneath the surface like submerged gardens. Schools of fish larger than anything in northern waters swirled around the hulls. Flying fish launched themselves from wave to wave, their silver bodies catching sunlight like scattered coins. Dolphins raced alongside the treasure ships, their playful leaps drawing laughter from crews who interpreted their presence as good fortune. But this beauty carried danger. Coral reefs that could gut even the strongest hull lurked just beneath inviting blue water. Sudden squalls materialized from clear skies, their winds strong enough to snap masts and their waves tall enough to swamp smaller vessels. Pirates operated from hidden bases among the countless islands, emerging without warning to attack merchant ships laden with valuable cargo. The treasure fleet's size and armament made it an unlikely target, but Zheng He maintained constant vigilance, his warships screening the flanks while fast scouts ranged ahead to identify threats. On the 10th day out from Nanjing, they encountered their first test. A squadron of pirates, perhaps 50 vessels of various sizes, appeared from behind a cluster of islands, clearly intending to investigate these unfamiliar ships. The pirate fleet was substantial by regional standards, capable of overwhelming most merchant vessels through sheer numbers. Their boats were fast and maneuverable, designed for hit-and-run attacks rather than prolonged engagements. Under different circumstances, they might have posed a serious threat. Zheng He's response was swift and decisive. Signal flags ran up the flagship's masts, immediately understood throughout the fleet. The treasure ships maintained their stately progress while the warships moved to intercept, their crews clearing for action with efficiency that spoke of extensive training. The pirates, accustomed to facing terrified merchants, found themselves confronting vessels that bristled with cannons and showed no sign of fear. The lead warship fired a single shot, not aimed to kill but to demonstrate capability. The sound rolled across the water like thunder, followed by a splash as the cannonball struck the sea perhaps 100 yards from the pirate leader's junk. No pirate vessel in these waters carried anything comparable to Chinese artillery. The message was clear: approach at your own peril. The pirate commander was experienced enough to recognize overwhelming force when he saw it. His vessels turned away without engaging, melting back into the island maze from which they had emerged. The entire encounter lasted less than an hour, but its implications resonated throughout the fleet. This was not a trading expedition that could be intimidated or a diplomatic mission that would negotiate with bandits. This was Chinese imperial power projecting itself across the seas, backed by military technology that rendered traditional pirate tactics obsolete. Word of the encounter spread quickly among the crew. Sailors who had wondered whether their magnificent ships could fight as well as they could sail now had their answer. The treasure fleet was not merely large, it was invincible by any reasonable standard. This knowledge settled into the collective consciousness of 28,000 men, transforming them from an expedition into a conquering force. As they approached Malaccan waters, the sea traffic increased dramatically. Chinese junks flying familiar flags passed regularly, their captains calling greetings across the water and sharing news from ports ahead. Arab dhows with their distinctive triangular sails moved north with cargoes of spices and precious stones. Javanese vessels loaded with rice and textiles worked their way between larger ships. The diversity was staggering. Dozens of different ship designs representing as many cultures, all drawn to these straits by the promise of profitable trade. The treasure fleet's appearance caused disruption among this maritime traffic. Merchant captains accustomed to being the largest vessels on the water suddenly found themselves dwarfed by ships that seemed to belong to a different age of the world. Some approached close enough to stare in wonder at the treasure ship's towering masts and multiple decks. Others gave the fleet a wide berth, uncertain whether these floating palaces represented opportunity or threat. On the morning of the 14th day, the coast of the Malay Peninsula appeared on the horizon. Low green hills rising from blue water, their slopes covered with vegetation so thick it seemed to pulse with life. This was their first glimpse of the tropical world that lay beyond China's borders, a landscape where nature operated by different rules, and abundance took forms unknown in temperate climates. Palm trees lined the beaches, their fronds swaying in breezes that carried scents of flowers and spices. Behind them, jungle stretched inland toward mountains that disappeared into cloud-wrapped peaks. The approach to Malacca revealed one of the great ports of the medieval world. The The harbor stretched for miles along a river mouth that provided safe anchorage for hundreds of vessels simultaneously. Wooden piers jutted into the water like fingers, each supporting warehouses where goods from across the known world awaited shipment. The city itself rose in terraces from the waterfront, a mixture of architectural styles reflecting its diverse population. Islamic minarets shared the skyline with Buddhist temples, Chinese guild halls stood beside Hindu shrines, and everywhere the red-tiled roofs of merchant houses caught the tropical sun. But what drew every eye was the sheer variety of vessels crowding the harbor. Chinese junks of every size floated beside Arab dhows and Indian coastal traders. Javanese ships with eyes painted on their prows shared anchorage with Siamese royal barges decorated in gold leaf. The harbor master's boats moved constantly between them, collecting fees and maintaining order among crews who spoke dozens of languages. This was the crossroads of Asian maritime trade, the place where fortunes were made and empires were sustained. The arrival of Zheng He's fleet transformed the harbor's normal bustle into chaos. Nothing like the treasure ships had ever been seen in these waters. The largest vessels in port were perhaps 1/4 their size. The total number of ships in the regular harbor traffic was less than the fleet itself. Sailors and merchants alike abandoned their tasks to stare at the approaching armada, their amazement visible even from a distance. The harbor master's boats that approached the fleet seemed like toys beside the treasure ships. Their occupants, normally confident officials accustomed to dealing with the greatest merchants of their age, appeared thoroughly intimidated by the scale of what they were witnessing. When they drew alongside Zheng He's flagship, they had to crane their necks to see the rail high above them, where Chinese officers looked down with expressions of polite interest. The negotiations that followed established the pattern for every subsequent encounter of the voyage. Zheng He did not request permission to enter the harbor. He announced his intention to do so. He did not seek an audience with the local ruler. He informed the officials that their sultan would have the honor of receiving the Chinese emperor's representative. The language was courteous, but the meaning was unmistakable. The treasure fleet operated under imperial authority that superseded local jurisdiction. Yet this assertion of power was paired with careful diplomacy. Zheng He's interpreters spoke perfect Malay and understood local customs. The gifts they presented to the harbor master were valuable enough to demonstrate respect without appearing to offer bribes. The Chinese admiral himself, when he finally appeared at the flagship's rail to acknowledge the local officials, cut an impressive figure. Tall and dignified, richly dressed, but not ostentatiously so, speaking in measured tones that carried natural authority. The Sultan of Malacca, Parameswara, faced a decision that would define his kingdom's future. He could attempt to resist this unprecedented display of foreign power, knowing that his own military forces were completely inadequate to the task. Or he could embrace the opportunity to align himself with what was clearly the greatest naval force in the world. His choice revealed the diplomatic genius that had built Malacca into a trading empire. Parameswara chose submission, but submission on terms that preserved his dignity and enhanced his power. He would acknowledge Chinese supremacy and accept the status of tributary kingdom. In return, he would receive Chinese protection against his enemies, access to Chinese trade goods, and recognition as the legitimate ruler of one of Southeast Asia's most important ports. The arrangement transformed potential conquest into profitable alliance. The ceremonial aspects of this submission unfolded over several days with pageantry that impressed even the Chinese. Parameswara arrived at the harbor aboard a royal barge that gleamed with gold decorations, escorted by war canoes whose crews performed synchronized paddle displays. His retinue included dancers and musicians, scholars and warriors, representatives of every community in his diverse kingdom. The Sultan himself was a small, dignified man whose presence commanded respect despite his physical limitations. He understood theater, and he staged his submission as a celebration rather than a defeat. The meeting between Parameswara and Zheng He took place aboard the flagship in a pavilion erected specifically for the occasion. Chinese craftsmen had worked through the night to create a temporary throne room that demonstrated imperial magnificence while accommodating local protocol. Silk tapestries bearing dragons and phoenixes lined the walls. Jade sculptures and gold ornaments reflected the tropical sun. Incense burned in bronze censers that had traveled 3,000 miles to perfume this moment. Zheng He received the Sultan while seated on a chair that was clearly a throne in everything but name. His robes were imperial yellow, a color reserved for the emperor himself, but cut in a style that acknowledged his status as representative rather than ruler. Behind him stood Chinese officials in rank order, their silk garments and jade ornaments creating a backdrop of understated wealth. The message was clear. The Sultan was meeting not just with an admiral, but with the power of the Chinese Empire itself. The gifts exchanged during this ceremony established precedents that would govern Chinese relations with Southeast Asian kingdoms for generations. Parameswara presented tribute appropriate to his status: rare spices, precious woods, exotic animals, and local manufactures that demonstrated Malaccan craftsmanship. The quantities were substantial, but not ruinous, carefully calculated to acknowledge Chinese superiority without bankrupting the donor. Zheng He's reciprocal gifts were magnificent beyond anything in Parameswara's experience, bolts of silk in colors that seemed to capture light itself. Porcelain vessels so thin they were translucent, decorated with patterns of impossible delicacy. Gold ornaments worked by Chinese craftsmen whose techniques were unknown outside the empire, lacquerware that gleamed like mirrors, books printed on paper of such quality it felt like fabric. Each item demonstrated Chinese technological and artistic superiority, while suggesting the abundance that flowed from the emperor's favor. But the most significant gift was intangible: recognition. By accepting Parameswara's tribute, Zheng He granted him legitimacy in Chinese eyes. This recognition would prove invaluable in future dealings with other Asian rulers, who understood that Chinese approval carried weight throughout the region. Malacca's status as a Chinese tributary would attract merchants seeking imperial protection and discourage enemies who feared imperial retaliation. The practical arrangements that followed this ceremonial submission revealed the sophistication of Chinese imperial administration. Zheng He's staff included specialists in tributary relations who understood the delicate balance between imperial authority and local autonomy. They negotiated agreements covering trade regulations, dispute resolution, and mutual assistance that would govern Chinese-Malaccan relations for decades. These documents were drafted in multiple languages, and copies were deposited in both Malacca and Beijing, creating a legal framework that transcended cultural differences. During their 2-week stay in Malacca, the treasure fleet's impact on the local economy was transformative. Chinese gold and silver flowed into markets that had never seen such quantities of precious metal. Local merchants found themselves able to purchase goods that had previously been beyond their reach. Craftsmen received commissions for items that would travel to the Forbidden City itself. The harbor buzzed with activity as Chinese purchasing agents sought products that might interest imperial officials, everything from rare medicines to exotic pets. The cultural exchange was equally remarkable. Chinese scholars studied local languages and customs, creating records that would inform future expeditions. Local intellectuals gained access to Chinese books and ideas that challenged their assumptions about the world. Buddhist monks from both cultures discovered shared traditions that transcended national boundaries. Muslim members of Zheng He's crew found co-religionists who practice Islam in distinctly Southeast Asian ways, creating theological discussions that continued long into tropical nights. The fleet's departure from Malacca was as carefully orchestrated as its arrival. Parameswara and his court gathered at the harbor to bid farewell to their new Chinese overlords. Ceremonial boats escorted the treasure ships to the harbor mouth, their occupants calling blessings across the water. The Sultan presented a final gift, a detailed chart of the waters ahead, annotated with information about currents, reefs, and safe harbors that would prove invaluable during the next stage of their journey. As the fleet sailed westward through the Strait of Malacca, Zheng He could reflect on the complete success of their first diplomatic encounter. They had established Chinese authority over one of Southeast Asia's most important trading centers without firing a shot in anger. They had demonstrated imperial power in ways that would be reported throughout the region. They had created a tributary relationship that would generate both profit and intelligence for decades to come. Most importantly, they had proven that Chinese diplomacy backed by overwhelming force could achieve objectives that pure military conquest might have made impossible. The strait itself presented new challenges and wonders. These were among the most dangerous waters in the world. Narrow channels where opposing currents created treacherous conditions, hidden reefs that could appear without warning, and pirate bases concealed among countless small islands. The local knowledge provided by Malaccan pilots proved essential, as the fleet navigated passages barely wide enough for the largest treasure ships. But the strait also revealed the abundance of tropical seas. Flying fish erupted from the water in silver clouds. Dolphins played in the bow waves of the great ships, their intelligence evident in their interactions with the crews. Sea turtles the size of dining tables surfaced near the fleet, their ancient eyes suggesting wisdom accumulated over centuries. At night, phosphorescent plankton turned the ship's wakes into streams of liquid light that seemed to write Chinese characters across the dark water. As they emerged from the strait into the open waters of the Andaman Sea, Zheng He's fleet faced its greatest test yet. They were leaving the relatively sheltered waters of Southeast Asia and entering the vast expanses of the Indian Ocean. The monsoon season was approaching, bringing winds and rains of devastating power. The distances between safe harbors would stretch their logistics to the limit. Most challenging of all, they were sailing towards civilizations that dwarfed even the impressive kingdom of Malacca, powers that might not prove as amenable to Chinese influence as the pragmatic Sultan Paramaswara. The Indian Ocean stretched before them like a blue infinity, its surface broken only by the occasional trading vessel or fishing boat. This was the highway that connected the civilizations of Asia and Africa, the route that had carried spices to Rome and silk to Alexandria. Now it carried the greatest fleet in human history toward encounters that would reshape the medieval world's understanding of what was possible on the open sea. Zheng He stood at his flagship's bow as the last islands of Southeast Asia disappeared astern, his tall frame silhouetted against the tropical sky. Behind him sailed 28,000 men who had placed their lives in his hands. Ahead lay waters that no Chinese admiral had ever crossed in force, leading to kingdoms that existed only as names in the reports of distant merchants. Everything that followed would test his leadership, his diplomacy, and his courage in ways that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. The wind filled the treasure ship's massive sails, pushing them westward toward India and the next chapter of their unprecedented voyage. The Indian Ocean revealed itself to be unlike any body of water the Chinese had ever encountered. Where the South China Sea offered the familiar rhythms of seasonal trade winds and predictable currents, these waters operated by laws that seemed to mock human understanding. The swells rolled in from vast distances, their power accumulated across thousands of miles of open ocean, lifting even the treasure ships like toys before letting them settle into troughs deep enough to hide smaller vessels entirely. The monsoon was building strength somewhere beyond the horizon, its approach announced by subtle changes that only the most experienced navigators could read. The wind shifted by degrees, never quite settling into steady patterns. Cloud formations gathered and dispersed according to atmospheric pressures that defied prediction. The very color of the water seemed different, deeper, more mysterious, holding secrets that generations of sailors had learned to fear. For 3 days, the fleet sailed through conditions that tested every aspect of their seamanship. The treasure ships handled the heavy seas with grace that vindicated their designers, their multiple compartments and sophisticated rudder systems keeping them stable when lesser vessels would have wallowed helplessly. But even Chinese naval architecture had limits, and those limits were being approached as the swells grew larger and the intervals between them shortened. On the morning of the 4th day, the lookouts spotted something that made every man in the fleet pause in whatever task occupied him. Rising from the sea ahead were mountains, not the gentle hills that marked most tropical coastlines, but genuine peaks that thrust into the sky like stone spears. These were the Western Ghats of India, the geological barrier that separated the coastal plains from the subcontinent's vast interior. Their appearance marked passage into waters that had witnessed 5,000 years of human civilization. As the fleet drew closer to shore, the evidence of that antiquity began to accumulate. Fishing boats appeared in increasing numbers, their designs unlike anything seen in Chinese waters. Temple spires became visible along the coastline, their architecture speaking of religious traditions that predated Buddhism's arrival in China. The very air seemed different, thick with humidity, but also with something else, a weight of history that pressed against the consciousness like incense smoke heavy with prayers offered across millennia. Their destination was Calicut, known to Arab traders as the City of Spices, and to Indian merchants as the gateway to the world's richest hinterland. The port controlled access to the pepper and cardamom that grew in the mountain forests behind it, the precious stones mined from ancient riverbeds, the cotton textiles that were prized from Cairo to Constantinople. More importantly, for Chinese purposes, it was ruled by the Zamorin, a Hindu king whose power extended across much of the Malabar coast and whose diplomatic recognition would legitimize Chinese authority throughout southern India. The approach to Calicut Harbor revealed why this city had become one of the great trading centers of the medieval world. The coastline curved in a natural arc that provided protection from the worst monsoon swells, while the mouth of a substantial river offered fresh water and access to the interior. Wooden piers extended far into deep water, their construction demonstrating engineering capabilities that impressed even Chinese observers. Behind them, the city rose in terraces from the waterfront, a maze of narrow streets and flat-roofed houses broken by the soaring towers of Hindu temples whose sculptured facades gleamed in the tropical sun. But what truly distinguished Calicut was the diversity of its maritime traffic. Arab dhows shared the harbor with Chinese junks and Indian coastal vessels. Ships from the Persian Gulf rode at anchor beside traders from the Red Sea. The flags that flew from hundreds of masts represented kingdoms and commercial houses from across the known world. This was not merely an Indian port, but a truly international marketplace where the wealth of continents changed hands according to prices set by supply and demand rather than royal decree. The reaction to Zheng He's fleet was immediate and dramatic. Harbor activity ceased as crews abandoned their tasks to stare at the approaching armada. The treasure ships dwarfed everything in port, their size so unprecedented that many observers initially mistook them for floating islands rather than human constructions. The sound of 28,000 men working their ships carried across the water like distant thunder, punctuated by the musical calls of Chinese officers coordinating their fleet's entry into this foreign harbor. The Zamorans' response demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic culture that had made Calicut a neutral meeting ground for competing civilizations. Rather than panic at this display of foreign power, he immediately dispatched emissaries to welcome the Chinese fleet while simultaneously sending messengers inland to alert his allies of these extraordinary developments. His harbor officials approached Zheng He's flagship in vessels decorated with silk banners and carrying gifts valuable enough to honor any foreign dignitary without appearing subservient. The negotiations that followed revealed complexities unknown in Malacca. The Zamorin ruled not as an absolute monarch, but as the senior partner in a confederation of kingdoms that maintained their independence while acknowledging his leadership in foreign affairs. His authority over trade was circumscribed by ancient agreements with merchant guilds whose privileges had been confirmed by generations of rulers. Most significantly, his realm was religiously diverse, Hindu in its foundation, but incorporating substantial Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities whose commercial networks extended across the Indian Ocean. Zheng He's diplomatic skills faced their severest test in navigating these religious and political currents. His own Muslim identity, carefully balanced against his service to a Chinese emperor, became both an asset and a complication. The substantial Muslim population of Calicut, primarily Arab and Persian merchants who had settled there over centuries, viewed him with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. Here was one of their faith who had risen to unprecedented power in the service of an infidel ruler. Was he a model to emulate or a cautionary tale of apostasy? The Hindu majority, led by Brahmin priests whose influence over the Zamorin was substantial, saw in Zheng He's arrival both opportunity and threat. Chinese trade could bring unprecedented prosperity to their kingdom, but Chinese power might disrupt the delicate religious balance that had allowed their diverse society to flourish. The admiral's personal conduct during his stay would be scrutinized for signs of respect or contempt for local customs, with political consequences that could affect the entire expedition. The meeting between Zheng He and the Zamorin took place in a palace that embodied the cultural complexity of medieval India. The throne room's architecture blended Hindu, Islamic, and indigenous elements in ways that created harmony from diversity. Carved columns depicted scenes from the Ramayana alongside geometric patterns inspired by Islamic mathematics. The ceiling was supported by wooden beams whose joints used Chinese techniques adapted to local materials. Persian carpets covered floors inlaid with semi-precious stones, according to patterns that might have originated in Central Asia or the Indian subcontinent itself. The Zamorin himself was a small, intelligent man whose presence dominated the vast chamber through sheer force of personality. His dress combined the sacred thread of Orthodox Hinduism with silk robes that demonstrated his kingdom's commercial wealth. His manner was courteous but guarded. He understood that he was meeting with a representative of the world's most powerful empire, but he also knew that his own kingdom was not without resources and that Chinese power, however impressive, was being projected across vast distances that complicated its effective application. The gifts exchanged during the ceremonial meeting established new standards for diplomatic magnificence. The Zamorin presented treasures that represented the best of Indian craftsmanship. Ivory carvings of impossible delicacy, cotton textiles so fine they seemed woven from light itself, spices whose rarity made them literally worth their weight in gold, and precious stones that captured tropical sunlight like crystallized rainbows. More significantly, he offered something that could not be purchased: knowledge. His scholars presented Chinese visitors with maps of the Indian Ocean trade routes, astronomical calculations that corrected Chinese understanding of southern hemisphere navigation, and medical treatises that described tropical diseases unknown in the temperate north. Zheng He's reciprocal gifts demonstrated Chinese capabilities that astonished even the cosmopolitan court of Calicut. Porcelain vessels whose translucency seemed to glow from within, silk textiles in colors that had no names in any Indian language, lacquerware that reflected images with mirror-like precision, mechanical clocks whose complexity suggested technological capabilities that bordered on the magical. But the most impressive gift was intellectual. Chinese texts on mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that revealed how the Middle Kingdom had achieved its material superiority. The negotiations that produced a formal alliance between China and Calicut required weeks of delicate diplomacy. Unlike Malacca, where Paramaswara had submitted to tributary status, the Zamorin insisted on an agreement between equals that preserved his dignity while acknowledging Chinese supremacy in matters of trade and navigation. The resulting treaty created a new model for Chinese foreign relations, one that would influence imperial policy for generations. Under its terms, Calicut acknowledged Chinese authority over the Indian Ocean sea routes while maintaining full autonomy over its internal affairs. The Zamorin agreed to provide assistance to future Chinese expeditions and to mediate disputes between Chinese traders and local merchants. In return, China guaranteed Calicut's territorial integrity against foreign invasion and promised preferential treatment in matters of trade. Most importantly, both parties agreed to respect each other's religious practices and to protect each other's nationals according to principles that transcended cultural differences. The practical implementation of this agreement revealed the sophistication of both Chinese and Indian administrative traditions. Joint committees were established to regulate trade, resolve disputes, and maintain the harbor facilities that both parties would use. Exchange rates were fixed for major currencies, standardizing transactions that had previously been subject to daily negotiation. Safe conduct passes were designed that would be honored by officials throughout the Chinese sphere of influence in the Zamorin's domains. Legal procedures were established for handling conflicts between merchants of different nationalities and religions. During the fleet's month-long stay in Calicut, the cultural exchange was transformative for both sides. Chinese scholars studied Hindu philosophy and mathematics, discovering concepts that challenged their understanding of the natural world. Indian intellectuals gained access to Chinese literature and scientific treatises that revealed alternative approaches to questions they had pondered for centuries. Buddhist monks from both cultures found common ground that transcended national boundaries, while Islamic scholars in Zheng He's entourage engaged in theological discussions with their Indian counterparts that continued long into the tropical nights. The economic impact was equally remarkable. Chinese demand for Indian spices, textiles, and precious stones created market conditions that elevated prices throughout the region. Local merchants found themselves able to command premiums for goods that Chinese buyers prized above domestic alternatives. Craftsmen received commissions for items that would grace imperial palaces in Beijing. The harbor bustled with activity, as Chinese purchasing agents sought products that might interest the Yongle emperor, everything from rare medicines to exotic animals that could stock the imperial menageries. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of permanent Chinese communities along the Indian coast. Some members of Zheng He's fleet, merchants, interpreters, and craftsmen, received permission to remain in Calicut to facilitate future Chinese trade. They married local women, learned local languages, and established businesses that would serve as bridges between civilizations for generations to come. These overseas Chinese communities would prove essential to the success of subsequent treasure fleet expeditions, providing local knowledge and commercial networks that no temporary visit could create. The fleet's departure from Calicut was delayed by the monsoon's arrival, a meteorological event that demonstrated nature's power over even the most sophisticated human enterprises. The rains began as scattered showers that turned the harbor's muddy water chocolate brown. Within days, they had intensified into torrential downpours that made deck work impossible and turned the city's streets into rivers. The wind shifted to patterns that would have made departure suicidal for any sailing vessel, regardless of size or construction. Zheng He used this enforced delay to complete his intelligence gathering about the regions that lay ahead. Arab merchants who had sailed these waters for generations provided detailed accounts of ports along the Arabian Peninsula and the East African coast. Indian traders who had established commercial relationships throughout the Western Indian Ocean offered insights into local politics and customs that would prove invaluable during future encounters. Persian captains shared knowledge of seasonal weather patterns and safe harbor locations that could mean the difference between success and disaster for expeditions operating thousands of miles from home. When the monsoon finally began to weaken, the treasure fleet faced its most challenging departure yet. The harbor mouth had become a maelstrom of conflicting currents created by months of torrential runoff from the Western Ghats. Waves that had built strength across thousands of miles of open ocean broke against the harbor's protective reefs in spectacular displays of power that sent spray flying higher than the treasure ship's masts. The timing of their departure required precision that left no margin for error. Too early, and they would sail into conditions that could destroy even their magnificent vessels. Too late, and they would miss the seasonal wind patterns essential for their next destination. Zheng He's decision to sail demonstrated the confidence that had made him the emperor's chosen admiral. On a morning when most harbor traffic remained safely at anchor, the treasure fleet began its carefully orchestrated departure from Calicut. The largest ships moved first, their massive bulk allowing them to punch through swells that would have overwhelmed smaller vessels. The coordinated seamanship of 28,000 men created a spectacle that drew crowds to every vantage point along the coast, hundreds of vessels moving in formation through conditions that challenged the limits of medieval naval technology. The Zamorin and his court gathered at the harbor's highest tower to witness their departure, a gesture of respect that honored both the Chinese expedition and the alliance they had forged. As the treasure ships cleared the harbor mouth, and their sails filled with the wind that would carry them toward their next destination, flags were exchanged between shore and fleet in a ceremony that formalized relationships created over weeks of negotiation and months of shared experience. Their next destination lay across 800 miles of open ocean, Ceylon, the island that ancient geographers had called Serendib, and that Arab traders knew as the source of cinnamon, sapphires, and pearls beyond price. But the direct route would take them through waters notorious for their unpredictability, where seasonal storms could materialize without warning and where navigational errors could prove fatal to entire expeditions. As the Indian coast disappeared behind them, Zheng He's fleet faced its greatest test of seamanship yet. They were sailing into the deep waters of the central Indian Ocean, following routes that Arab navigators had used for centuries, but that no Chinese fleet had ever attempted. The monsoon winds that now filled their sails could shift direction with devastating suddenness. The currents that aided their progress could reverse without warning. Most dangerously, they were beyond the range of coastal navigation, dependent entirely on their compasses, their star charts, and their admiral's judgment for survival. The treasure ships handled the deep ocean swells with the majesty that had made them the wonder of every port they had visited. Their motion through the water was stately and purposeful, like floating palaces that carried the authority of the Chinese Empire toward encounters that would reshape the medieval world's understanding of what was possible through human ambition and technological superiority. From his flagship's deck, Zheng He watched the sun set over waters that stretched unbroken to horizons that might conceal anything: hostile fleets, unknown islands, opportunities for glory, or the kind of disasters that could end expeditions and destroy reputations. Behind him sailed the greatest armada in human history. Ahead lay Ceylon, and the next test of Chinese power projected across distances that challenged every assumption about what navies could accomplish in an age when most rulers had never seen the ocean. The wind sang through the treasure ship's rigging as they sailed through the tropical night, their passage marked by phosphorescent wakes that wrote temporary characters of light across the dark water. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new encounters, new opportunities to demonstrate that the Middle Kingdom's reach now extended to the very edges of the known world. The island of Ceylon emerged from the morning haze like a jewel dropped into sapphire waters, its central mountains soaring into clouds while palm-fringed beaches stretched along a coastline that seemed designed by artists rather than carved by geological forces. This was Serendib, the island whose very name had given birth to the word serendipity, a place where happy accidents and unexpected discoveries awaited those bold enough to venture so far from familiar shores. The treasure fleet's approach to Ceylon's principal port of Colombo created the same mixture of wonder and consternation that had marked every arrival since leaving China. Local fishing boats scattered like startled birds before the advancing armada, their crews pointing and shouting in languages that mixed Tamil, Sinhala, and Arabic in combinations that reflected the island's position at the crossroads of Asian maritime trade. The harbor master's vessels that ventured out to meet them seemed absurdly small beside the treasure ships, gnats approaching elephants with a confidence born of necessity rather than courage. But Ceylon was different from any place they had encountered. Where Malacca had been pragmatically commercial and Calicut politically complex, this island possessed an almost mystical quality that affected even the most hardened sailors. The air itself seemed different, not just tropical, but somehow sanctified, as if centuries of Buddhist devotion had altered its very chemistry. The mountains that dominated the interior were said to hold footprints left by the Buddha himself, pilgrimage sites that drew devotees from across the Buddhist world. King Alagakanara, who ruled Ceylon from his capital at Kauda, was himself a Buddhist whose devotion to the Dharma was matched only by his understanding of practical politics. His island controlled the sea routes between India and Southeast Asia, its harbors serving as essential waypoints for any expedition crossing the Indian Ocean. More crucially for a man of his religious convictions, Ceylon was renowned throughout the Buddhist world as the guardian of orthodox teachings, the place where the Pali Canon had been preserved in its purest form and where monks from distant lands came to study authentic doctrine. The king's response to Zheng He's arrival reflected this unique combination of spiritual authority and commercial pragmatism. Rather than simply send harbor officials to negotiate with the Chinese fleet, he dispatched his most senior Buddhist abbot, a man whose learning was renowned from Tibet to Java and whose presence aboard the treasure flagship would honor both parties while opening theological discussions that transcended mere diplomatic protocol. The abbot who climbed aboard Zheng He's flagship was ancient beyond measure, his saffron robes somehow remaining immaculate despite the climb up the ship's towering sides. His eyes held the clarity that comes from decades of meditation, but they also sparkled with the curiosity of a scholar encountering ideas that challenged his understanding of the world. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of authentic wisdom, addressing Zheng He in flawless Chinese that he had learned from pilgrims who had traveled to Ceylon from the Middle Kingdom generations before. The conversation that followed was unlike any diplomatic exchange of the voyage. Where previous rulers had focused on trade agreements and tributary relationships, the abbot engaged Zheng He in discussions that ranged from navigation techniques to philosophical questions about the nature of imperial power. He was particularly interested in the admiral's personal journey, how a Muslim boy from Yunnan had risen to command Buddhist sailors in service to a Confucian emperor, what tensions this created in his own spiritual understanding, and how he reconciled competing loyalties that might have torn a lesser man apart. Zheng He's responses revealed depths of character that his public role rarely allowed him to display. He spoke of finding harmony rather than conflict among the religious traditions that shaped his world, how Islamic concepts of surrender to divine will complemented Confucian ideas about social harmony, how Buddhist teachings about compassion could guide the exercise of imperial power, how his own spiritual journey had been enriched rather than complicated by exposure to multiple paths toward truth. The abbot listened with the attention that marked a true teacher, occasionally nodding or asking questions that probed deeper into these philosophical waters. When Zheng He finished speaking, the old man was silent for a long moment before offering an observation that would resonate through the admiral's consciousness for the remainder of his life. Perhaps the Buddha's teaching about the middle way applies not only to individual spiritual practice but to the governance of empires. Too much force destroys what you seek to protect. Too little allows chaos to flourish. The wise ruler, like the wise practitioner, finds the path between extremes. This theological foundation transformed the subsequent political negotiations into something approaching a spiritual exercise. King Alagakonara, when he finally met with Zheng He in a palace that was as much monastery as royal residence, approached their discussions with the detachment of a philosopher examining abstract principles rather than the anxiety of a ruler facing potential conquest. His questions about Chinese intentions were probing but not hostile. His concerns about Ceylon's autonomy expressed with the calm confidence of someone who understood that attachment to outcomes was itself a source of suffering. The agreement they reached reflected this unusual diplomatic atmosphere. Ceylon would acknowledge Chinese supremacy over the Indian Ocean trade routes while maintaining complete internal autonomy, including its role as the center of Orthodox Buddhist teaching. The island would provide safe harbor and supplies for Chinese expeditions while receiving protection from external threats and preferential treatment in matters of trade. Most significantly, both parties agreed to facilitate religious exchange. Chinese Buddhist monks would be welcomed at Ceylon's monasteries, while Ceylonese teachers would be invited to establish schools in Chinese territories. But the most remarkable aspect of their month-long stay in Ceylon was the spiritual impact it had on Zheng He himself. The admiral spent hours in conversation with Buddhist scholars whose understanding of doctrine had been refined over centuries of study and practice. He participated in meditation sessions that introduced him to techniques for achieving mental clarity under conditions of extreme stress. He visited the mountain shrines where pilgrims from across Asia came to pay homage to the Buddha's memory, experiencing firsthand the devotion that made Ceylon sacred to hundreds of millions of believers. These experiences created changes in Zheng He's leadership style that his subordinates noticed immediately. His orders became less frequent but more precisely targeted. His responses to crises combined strategic thinking with a kind of philosophical detachment that allowed him to see situations more clearly than before. His treatment of both Chinese sailors and foreign dignitaries reflected a deeper understanding of human nature that made his authority more effective because it was more compassionate. The practical benefits of their Ceylon alliance were equally significant. The island's position made it an ideal base for operations throughout the Indian Ocean, while its Buddhist connections provided diplomatic entry into kingdoms that might have been suspicious of purely Chinese approaches. The spices, gems, and textiles that flowed from Ceylon's markets were valuable in themselves, but the real prize was strategic, a secure foothold in the heart of the ocean that connected 3 continents. During their stay, Zheng He's intelligence network gathered information about the regions that lay ahead. Arab traders provided detailed accounts of the Hormuz Strait that controlled access to the Persian Gulf, describing the powerful kingdom that collected tribute from every vessel passing between the Indian Ocean and the rich markets of Mesopotamia. Indian merchants who had established commercial relationships along the East African coast offered insights into the Swahili city-states whose wealth came from gold mines in the mysterious interior. Persian captains shared knowledge of seasonal weather patterns and political conditions that could determine the success or failure of future expeditions. Most intriguingly, they heard persistent rumors about Chinese communities that had been established along the African coast during previous voyages. Descendants of earlier expeditions who had married local women and created hybrid cultures that blended Middle Kingdom traditions with African customs. These reports were fragmentary and often contradictory, but they suggested that Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean was more extensive and permanent than even Beijing fully understood. The departure from Ceylon was marked by ceremonies that reflected the unique spiritual dimension of their alliance. Buddhist monks from the island's most prestigious monasteries gathered at the harbor to chant blessings for the Chinese fleet's safe passage, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with the wind itself. King Alagakonara presented Zheng He with a relic, a fragment of the Buddha's alms bowl that was among Ceylon's most precious treasures, as a symbol of the spiritual bond that now connected their kingdoms. In return, Zheng He made a gesture that surprised even his own officers. He invited a dozen of Ceylon's most promising young monks to join his expedition, offering them the opportunity to establish a Buddhist temple in Calicut and to serve as permanent religious advisors to future Chinese missions in the Indian Ocean. This decision reflected his growing understanding that lasting influence required cultural as well as military foundations, that the Chinese Empire's reach would be measured not just in tributary payments, but in the depth of relationships created across civilizational boundaries. As the treasure fleet sailed northwest from Ceylon toward the Arabian Peninsula, the seasonal winds that had aided their progress began to shift in ways that tested even Chinese navigational expertise. They were entering waters where the monsoon patterns were more complex and less predictable than anything they had previously encountered. The currents that flowed through the narrow passages between India and Arabia created conditions that could change hourly, making navigation as much art as science. The Arabian Sea revealed itself to be the most challenging body of water the expedition had yet encountered. Unlike the relatively sheltered South China Sea or the broad expanses of the central Indian Ocean, these waters were constrained by geography that created accelerated currents and unpredictable wind patterns. The proximity of vast desert landmasses created temperature differentials that spawned localized storms with devastating suddenness. Most dangerously, they were entering waters that had been dominated for centuries by Arab navigators whose superior local knowledge gave them tactical advantages that could offset Chinese technological superiority. Their destination was Hormuz, the island fortress that controlled the narrow strait connecting the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. Every ship carrying silk to Baghdad, spices to Damascus, or pearls to Cairo had to pass under the guns of Hormuz's massive fortifications and pay tribute to its rulers. The kingdom's wealth was legendary, its palaces decorated with tiles that seemed to capture sunlight itself, its markets offering goods from 3 continents, its ruler commanding fleets that could challenge any naval force in the Western Indian Ocean. But Hormuz was also strategically vulnerable in ways that Chinese intelligence had identified during their preparation for this voyage. The island's position at the mouth of the Persian Gulf made it dependent on trade for survival. Its own agricultural production was negligible. Its fresh water came from mainland sources that could be interdicted by hostile forces, and its military strength was designed for coastal defense rather than power projection across oceanic distances. Most significantly, its rulers had grown accustomed to dealing with individual trading expeditions rather than coordinated naval forces capable of sustained operations. The approach to Hormuz Harbor demonstrated why this fortress port had dominated Gulf trade for centuries. The island rose from the water like a natural citadel, its rocky cliffs topped by walls that seemed to grow organically from the stone itself. The harbor was defended by towers that commanded every approach, their cannon embrasures designed to create overlapping fields of fire that could devastate any attacking fleet. Behind these fortifications, the city spread across the island's more hospitable valleys, a maze of narrow streets and flat-roofed houses punctuated by the minarets of mosques and the towers of merchant palaces. The sight of Zheng He's fleet approaching this formidable position created panic along Hormuz's waterfront. Harbor officials who were accustomed to intimidating individual trading vessels found themselves facing an armada that outnumbered their entire defensive fleet several times over. The treasure ship's size alone rendered conventional defensive tactics obsolete. Their high sides and multiple decks provided platforms for artillery that could fire over the harbor's protective walls, while their massive construction made them virtually immune to the types of weapons that Hormuz's fortifications were designed to deploy. The kingdom's response revealed both strength and weakness. King Salgar ibn Muhammad, who ruled Hormuz from a palace that rivaled anything in Persia or Arabia, immediately mobilized his military forces while simultaneously dispatching diplomatic envoys to negotiate with the Chinese fleet. His strategy was sophisticated: demonstrate enough strength to command respect while offering enough cooperation to avoid unnecessary conflict. The result was a carefully orchestrated display of power that impressed even Chinese observers while making clear that Hormuz was prepared to defend itself if diplomacy failed. The negotiations that followed were the most complex of the voyage, involving not just bilateral discussions between China and Hormuz, but multilateral considerations that included the Ottoman Empire, various Persian principalities, and the Mamluk Sultanate that controlled Egypt and Syria. Hormuz's strategic position made it impossible to alter its political status without affecting the interests of multiple major powers, while Chinese objectives required acknowledgement of imperial authority that might conflict with existing tributary relationships. Zheng He's approach to these challenges demonstrated the diplomatic sophistication that had made him the Yongle Emperor's chosen representative. Rather than demanding exclusive Chinese authority over Hormuz, he proposed a more nuanced arrangement that preserved the island's existing relationships while establishing Chinese primacy in matters of naval security. Hormuz would continue paying tribute to its traditional overlords while acknowledging Chinese control over the sea routes that brought it prosperity. The kingdom's defensive capabilities would be enhanced by Chinese military advisors, while its commercial networks would be integrated into the broader system of Chinese protected trade. The personal relationship between Zheng He and King Salgar proved crucial to these negotiations' success. Both men were sophisticated products of multicultural societies, Zheng He with his Muslim faith and Chinese service, Salgar with his Arab heritage and Persian cultural influences. Both understood the delicate balance required to maintain authority over diverse populations, whose loyalty depended on perceived benefits rather than ethnic solidarity. Most importantly, both recognized that their kingdom's long-term interests were better served by accommodation than by conflict. The agreement they reached became a model for Chinese relations with strategically important territories throughout the Western Indian Ocean. Hormuz acknowledged Chinese supremacy over maritime trade while maintaining autonomy in internal affairs and existing tributary relationships with land-based powers. Chinese naval forces would be granted basing rights in Hormuz harbors, while the kingdom's defensive capabilities would be enhanced through technology transfer and military cooperation. Trade between China and the Persian Gulf would be facilitated through preferential agreements that benefited both parties while generating revenue for Hormuz's royal treasury. The month-long Chinese presence in Hormuz created cultural and economic impacts that would resonate for generations. The kingdom's markets were flooded with Chinese goods of unprecedented quality, silks that seemed to shimmer with their own light, porcelains that combined beauty with utility in ways that local craftsmen had never imagined, mechanical devices that demonstrated technological capabilities that bordered on the magical. Local merchants found themselves able to command premium prices for goods that Chinese buyers prized, while craftsmen received commissions for items that would grace imperial palaces thousands of miles away. But the most significant development was the establishment of permanent Chinese diplomatic and commercial missions that would maintain relationships between the kingdoms regardless of future expeditionary schedules. These missions, staffed by Chinese Muslims who could navigate both cultures with equal facility, became centers for ongoing intelligence gathering, commercial negotiation, and cultural exchange that extended Chinese influence far beyond what temporary visits could achieve. The religious dimensions of Chinese-Hormuz relations proved particularly complex and ultimately transformative. Zheng He's Islamic faith, combined with his obvious authority and sophisticated understanding of both Chinese and Arab cultures, created opportunities for theological discussion that challenged assumptions on both sides. Local Islamic scholars were fascinated by accounts of Chinese Muslim communities that had maintained their faith while serving non-Muslim rulers, while Chinese Muslims in the expedition gained exposure to Orthodox Islamic teachings that had been preserved in their purest forms along the Arabian Peninsula. These religious exchanges produced practical benefits that extended far beyond theological curiosity. The network of Islamic scholars and merchants that connected communities from Morocco to Malaysia provided intelligence and commercial opportunities that proved invaluable to Chinese strategic planning. Conversely, Chinese protection of Muslim trading vessels created goodwill throughout the Islamic world that facilitated diplomatic and commercial relationships from Cairo to Jakarta. As the treasure fleet prepared to depart Hormuz for the final leg of their westward journey, the seasonal wind patterns that governed Indian Ocean navigation began shifting in ways that would determine their route toward the East African coast. The monsoons that had carried them westward were weakening, while the counter-monsoons that would eventually push them back toward China were still months away. This created a narrow window of opportunity for reaching the Swahili ports that controlled trade in gold, ivory, and exotic animals from the African interior. The intelligence gathered in Hormuz about conditions along the East African coast revealed both opportunities and dangers that would test every aspect of Chinese naval capabilities. The Swahili city-states were wealthy and sophisticated but politically fragmented, creating possibilities for Chinese influence while requiring careful navigation of local rivalries. The seasonal weather patterns along the African coast were notoriously unpredictable, with sudden storms that could drive even large vessels onto reefs that lurked just beneath deceptively clear water. Most challenging of all, they would be operating at the very limit of their logistical capabilities, thousands of miles from any secure base and dependent entirely on local cooperation for the supplies essential to their survival. The departure from Hormuz was marked by ceremonies that reflected the genuine respect that had developed between Chinese and Arab cultures during their month of intensive interaction. King Selgar and his court gathered at the harbor to bid farewell to their Chinese guests, while Zheng He's officers exchanged gifts and personal tokens that symbolized relationships transcending official diplomacy. The sight of the treasure fleet departing Hormuz harbor, hundreds of vessels moving in precise formation, past fortifications that had never been challenged by such overwhelming force, became part of regional legend that would be recounted for centuries. As they sailed southwest toward the African coast, Zheng He's fleet entered waters that few Chinese had ever seen, and none had navigated in such force. They were pushing the boundaries of the known world, sailing toward encounters with civilizations that existed at the very edges of Asian geographic knowledge. The distances involved were staggering, thousands of miles of open ocean separating them from any secure base, with success or failure depending entirely on their ability to establish relationships with peoples whose languages they barely understood, and whose political systems operated according to principles that challenged Chinese assumptions about proper governance. The treasure ships handled the challenging conditions of the Western Indian Ocean with the same grace that had marked their performance throughout the voyage. but the psychological pressures on their crews were becoming evident. These men had been away from home for over a year, sailing through waters that grew progressively more foreign and dangerous with each passing month. The exotic wonders they encountered were balanced by constant awareness that they were operating beyond the range of any possible rescue or reinforcement. Their survival depended entirely on their admiral's judgment, their ship's seaworthiness, and their ability to establish diplomatic relationships with rulers who had never seen Chinese power and might not be impressed by its demonstration. From his flagship's deck, Zheng He watched the African coast emerge from the morning haze, a low green line that marked the beginning of their most ambitious diplomatic undertaking yet. Behind him sailed 28,000 men whose loyalty had been tested by months of challenging conditions and whose courage would soon face its ultimate examination. Ahead lay kingdoms whose wealth was legendary, but whose military capabilities remained unknown. Rulers whose cooperation would determine whether the treasure fleet's achievements were remembered as the greatest success in Chinese naval history or its most catastrophic failure. The wind that filled their sails carried scents that spoke of a continent unlike any they had encountered. Spices that grew nowhere else in the world, flowers whose fragrances seemed to intoxicate even the sea breeze that bore them, and underneath everything else, the rich earth smell of Africa itself, a landmass that had nurtured human civilization since its very beginning and now awaited the arrival of visitors from the world's eastern edge. The East African coast revealed itself to be unlike anything the Chinese had ever imagined. Where the shores of Southeast Asia had been lush and welcoming, and the coasts of India had spoken of ancient civilizations, this landmass seemed to pulse with a primal energy that predated human memory. Baobab trees rose from the shoreline like monuments erected by gods, their massive trunks speaking of millennia spent watching the tides. Behind them stretched savannas that seemed to breathe with the movement of creatures whose very existence challenged Chinese understanding of what was possible in the natural world. The first Swahili port they encountered was Malindi, a city that had grown wealthy from its position as a waypoint between the gold mines of the interior and the trading networks of the Indian Ocean. The harbor was smaller than those of Calicut or Hormuz, but it bustled with activity that spoke of connections stretching across continents. Arab dhows shared anchorage with Indian trading vessels and mysterious craft whose designs suggested origins far up the coast in regions that existed only as rumors in the accounts of the most adventurous merchants. The reaction to the treasure fleet's arrival was immediate and electric. Never had the people of Malindi seen ships of such size or number. The treasure vessels seemed to dwarf not just every other craft in the harbor, but the city itself, their towering masts and multiple decks creating silhouettes that belonged more to floating palaces than to any conceivable sailing vessel. The sound of 28,000 men working their ships carried across the water like the voice of some vast organism, punctuated by the musical calls of Chinese officers coordinating movements that required precision beyond anything local observers had ever witnessed. Sultan Ahmad ibn Muhammad, who ruled Malindi from a palace built of coral stone that gleamed white in the tropical sun, faced a decision that would define his kingdom's future. His city-state was prosperous but small, wealthy but vulnerable to the larger powers that dominated East African politics. The appearance of this unprecedented Chinese fleet offered opportunities that could transform Malindi into the most important port between Hormuz and the Cape, but it also carried dangers that could destroy everything his family had built over generations. The Sultan's response demonstrated the political sophistication that had made Swahili civilization a bridge between Africa and Asia for centuries. Rather than panic at this display of foreign power or attempt to resist forces that clearly overwhelmed his military capabilities, he immediately dispatched his most skilled diplomats to welcome the Chinese fleet while simultaneously sending messengers to rival kingdoms along the coast. His strategy was to embrace Chinese protection while using it to enhance Malindi's position relative to competing ports, whose rulers might prove less accommodating to these powerful visitors. The envoys who boarded Zheng He's flagship represented the cultural complexity that defined Swahili society. They spoke Arabic with the fluency of native speakers, but their dress combined elements from Persia, India, and local African traditions in ways that created something entirely unique. Their leader, a man named Ibrahim ibn Yusuf, who served as the Sultan's chief minister, had traveled extensively throughout the Indian Ocean world and possessed the kind of cosmopolitan sophistication that made international diplomacy possible in an age when cultural misunderstandings could spark wars. The negotiations that followed revealed Melindi's strategic value to Chinese objectives in ways that had not been apparent from distant planning sessions in Beijing. The city commanded the sea approaches to the Zambezi River system, which provided access to the gold mines and ivory hunting grounds of the interior. Its merchants maintained trading relationships with kingdoms hundreds of miles inland, bringing to the coast goods that could command extraordinary prices in Asian markets. Most importantly for Chinese intelligence purposes, Malindi served as an information hub where news from across the East African coast was collected, analyzed, and distributed to traders whose commercial success depended on accurate knowledge of political and economic conditions throughout the region. Sultan Ahmad proved to be an ideal Chinese ally, ambitious enough to welcome the opportunities that imperial protection provided, but realistic enough to understand the responsibilities that such protection entailed. His kingdom was small enough that Chinese influence could be decisive without requiring massive commitments of men and resources, but sophisticated enough that Chinese objectives could be achieved through diplomatic cooperation rather than military occupation. The agreement they negotiated became a model for Chinese relations with minor powers throughout their sphere of influence. Under its terms, Malindi became a Chinese protectorate that maintained complete internal autonomy while acknowledging imperial authority over foreign relations and maritime trade. The Sultan agreed to provide harbor facilities and supplies for Chinese expeditions while receiving guarantees of protection against external threats and preferential treatment in commercial matters. Most significantly, Malindi would serve as the Chinese administrative center for East Africa, with the Sultan's officials working alongside Chinese representatives to coordinate relationships with other coastal kingdoms and inland trading partners. The practical implementation of this agreement required innovations in imperial administration that would influence Chinese foreign policy for generations. A permanent Chinese mission was established in Malindi, staffed by officials who spoke Arabic and Swahili and who understood local customs well enough to serve effectively as cultural intermediaries. Chinese naval patrols were organized to protect merchant vessels flying Malindi flags, while the Sultan's own maritime forces were enhanced with Chinese weapons and training that made them formidable opponents for any pirate or rival kingdom that might challenge the new arrangements. During their 6-week stay in Malindi, the cultural exchange was transformative for both sides. Chinese scholars encountered African intellectual traditions that challenged their assumptions about the relationship between civilization and geography. They discovered astronomical observations that corrected Chinese understanding of Southern Hemisphere navigation, mathematical concepts that had been developed independently of Asian traditions, and historical accounts that revealed the antiquity and sophistication of African political systems. Local intellectuals gained access to Chinese literature and scientific treatises that opened new perspectives on questions they had pondered for generations, while craftsmen learned techniques that would revolutionize everything from metalworking to textile production. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their stay was the expedition's encounter with the natural wonders of East Africa. Chinese naturalists, accustomed to the relatively familiar fauna of Asian regions, found themselves documenting creatures that seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Giraffes whose necks stretched impossibly toward the sky, their gentle eyes and graceful movements creating an almost mystical impression on observers who had never imagined such beings could exist. Elephants, whose size dwarfed their Asian cousins, their tusks carved into spirals that African craftsmen transformed into artworks of breathtaking beauty. Rhinoceros, whose prehistoric appearance seemed to connect the present age with the world's creation, their massive presence commanding respect from even the most experienced Chinese soldiers. The most spectacular encounter occurred during a hunting expedition that Sultan Ahmad organized to demonstrate his kingdom's unique resources. The party traveled inland through landscapes that seemed painted by artists rather than shaped by geological forces. Vast grasslands that stretched to horizons broken only by acacia trees whose umbrella-shaped canopies provided islands of shade and an ocean of golden grass. As they crested a low ridge, the Chinese delegation found themselves looking down at one of nature's greatest spectacles. Thousands upon thousands of animals moving across the savanna in migrations that had followed the same route since before human memory. Zebras moved in geometric patterns that seemed designed by mathematicians, their stripes creating optical illusions that confused both predators and observers. Wildebeest traveled in vast herds, whose dust clouds rose like incense toward a sky so blue it seemed artificial. Lions lounged in whatever shade they could find, their presence keeping the herbivore herds in constant motion, while their dignified bearing suggested royalty that owed nothing to human concepts of nobility. Leopards moved through acacia branches with fluid grace that seemed to defy physical laws, while cheetahs demonstrated speed that challenged Chinese understanding of what was possible in the natural world. The Chinese naturalists struggled to document creatures that exceeded their vocabulary's capacity for description. How could they explain to the Yongle Emperor, accustomed to the relatively modest wildlife of temperate China, that Africa contained animals whose very existence seemed to mock the established order of nature? Their written reports would be supplemented by live specimens, a giraffe that would become the wonder of the Forbidden City, a zebra whose stripes would inspire new patterns in Chinese textile design, and various smaller creatures whose exotic appearance would stock imperial menageries for generations. But the expedition's most significant discovery was not zoological, but political. Deep in the interior, beyond the reach of coastal kingdoms and Arab trading networks, they encountered evidence of a civilization whose scope and sophistication challenged every assumption about African political organization. Great Zimbabwe, as later explorers would name it, was a kingdom built around massive stone structures that required engineering capabilities and organizational resources comparable to anything in China itself. Its rulers commanded trade networks that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. Its craftsmen worked gold and copper with techniques that rivaled the best Asian traditions, and its military forces maintained order over territories larger than many Chinese provinces. The Chinese envoys who traveled inland to establish contact with this mysterious kingdom returned with accounts that read like fairy tales but were supported by physical evidence that could not be disputed. They described cities whose walls were built of fitted stone without mortar, their construction demonstrating masonry techniques that Chinese engineers found impressive. They reported palace complexes that covered acres, their courtyards filled with artworks created from gold and ivory in quantities that spoke of wealth beyond anything on the East African coast. Most remarkably, they brought back diplomatic gifts that included textiles, metalwork, and carved objects whose quality equaled the finest products of Chinese workshops. The establishment of formal relations with Great Zimbabwe required delicate negotiations that tested every aspect of Chinese diplomatic expertise. The kingdom's ruler, who bore the title Mambo and commanded authority that extended over hundreds of thousands of subjects, was no minor chieftain impressed by Chinese technological demonstrations. He governed a sophisticated state with established traditions of international commerce, military organization, and territorial administration that had evolved independently of any Asian influence. His court included advisors who spoke Arabic and understood the broader Indian Ocean world well enough to evaluate Chinese claims of universal authority with appropriate skepticism. The agreement finally reached between China and Great Zimbabwe represented a triumph of mutual respect over cultural arrogance. The African kingdom acknowledged Chinese supremacy over maritime trade routes while maintaining complete autonomy in internal affairs and territorial expansion. Great Zimbabwe agreed to provide Chinese expeditions with supplies and safe passage through its territories, while China guaranteed the kingdom's access to Asian markets and protection for its commercial interests throughout the Indian Ocean. Most significantly, both parties established permanent diplomatic missions that would facilitate ongoing cooperation regardless of future changes in personnel or policy. The economic implications of this alliance were staggering. Great Zimbabwe controlled access to gold mines whose output could significantly impact currency systems throughout Asia. Its ivory traders supplied materials that were prized from Cairo to Canton, while its copper deposits offered strategic resources that could enhance Chinese military capabilities. The kingdom's agricultural surplus could provision expeditions operating thousands of miles from home, while its population provided potential markets for Chinese manufactured goods that could generate profits for generations of merchants. But the strategic value of the Zimbabwe alliance transcended immediate economic benefits. The kingdom's position in the African interior made it an ideal base for intelligence gathering about regions that remained completely unknown to Chinese geographers. Its rulers possessed knowledge about river systems that might provide water routes deep into the continent, about mineral deposits that could rival those of Asia itself, and about other African kingdoms whose cooperation might extend Chinese influence across the entire southern portion of the continent. The cultural exchange between Chinese and Zimbabwean civilizations proved equally valuable. Chinese scholars gained exposure to African philosophical traditions that approach universal questions from entirely different perspectives, while local intellectuals discovered Chinese solutions to problems of governance, technology, and social organization that challenged their understanding of what human societies could achieve. The synthesis of these intellectual traditions would influence both cultures for centuries, creating new approaches to everything from agricultural techniques to astronomical observation. As the treasure fleet prepared to depart East Africa for the return voyage to China, Zheng He reflected on achievements that exceeded even the ambitious objectives set by the Yongle Emperor. They had established Chinese authority over trade routes spanning 3 continents, created diplomatic relationships with kingdoms whose combined populations numbered in the tens of millions, and gathered intelligence about regions that had existed only as rumors in the most speculative geographic treatises. The tribute and trade goods that now filled their holds would demonstrate Chinese reach to audiences throughout Asia, while the permanent missions they had established would maintain imperial influence long after the treasure ships returned to their home ports. But perhaps the most significant achievement was less tangible: the transformation of China's understanding of its place in the world. The Middle Kingdom had always conceived of itself as the center of human civilization, surrounded by barbarian peoples whose submission was both natural and inevitable. The treasure fleet's encounters with sophisticated civilizations from Malacca to Zimbabwe had revealed a world of complex societies whose accomplishments challenged Chinese assumptions about cultural superiority, while their cooperation demonstrated the practical benefits of mutual respect over imperial arrogance. The departure from Malindi was marked by ceremonies that reflected the genuine friendship that had developed between Chinese and African peoples during months of intensive interaction. Sultan Ahmad and his court gathered at the harbor to bid farewell to their Chinese guests, while Zheng He's officers exchanged gifts and personal tokens that symbolized relationships transcending official diplomacy. Local musicians performed compositions that blended traditional African rhythms with melodies learned from Chinese court music, creating new art forms that would influence both cultures for generations. The sight of the treasure fleet departing Malindi Harbor, hundreds of vessels moving in precise formation past shorelines where giraffes grazed and elephants came to drink, became part of regional legend that would be recounted for centuries. Children would grow up hearing stories of the great Chinese admiral who had brought ships larger than palaces to trade with their grandfathers, while adults would measure all subsequent visitors against the standard of magnificence that Zheng He's expedition had established. As they sailed eastward toward home, the treasure ships were loaded with more than trade goods and tribute. They carried live animals whose very existence would astound Chinese court audiences, crafted objects that would influence Asian artistic traditions for generations, and seeds that would transform Chinese gardens into showcases for plants from 3 continents. Their holds contained maps that corrected centuries of geographic misconceptions, while their logs recorded navigational data that would guide Chinese maritime activities for decades to come. But the most valuable cargo was invisible: the experience and knowledge that had transformed every member of the expedition from provincial Chinese into citizens of a world whose scope and complexity exceeded anything they had imagined when they departed Nanjing years before. These men had seen empires that rivaled China in wealth and sophistication, had witnessed natural wonders that challenged every assumption about the possible, and had participated in diplomatic achievements that extended Chinese influence across distances that made their homeland seem almost insignificantly small in the context of global civilization. The return voyage presented challenges that tested the expedition's resources and resolve in new ways. The seasonal wind patterns that had aided their westward progress were now working against them, requiring careful navigation and patient seamanship that stretched supply lines to their breaking points. The ships themselves, magnificent as they were, showed signs of wear from 2 years of constant ocean service, rigging that needed replacement, hulls that required careening, and systems that demanded maintenance beyond what could be accomplished at sea. More significantly, the psychological pressures of prolonged absence from home were beginning to affect crew morale in ways that threatened the expedition's cohesion. These men had endured hardships and witnessed wonders that few human beings in history had experienced. But they were also fathers who had not seen their children grow, husbands who had left young wives to face years of uncertainty, and sons whose parents might have died while they sailed through distant seas pursuing imperial objectives that sometimes seemed abstract compared to personal losses that were devastatingly real. Zheng He's leadership during this challenging period demonstrated why the Yongle Emperor had chosen him for the greatest naval command in Chinese history. He understood that maintaining discipline among 28,000 men operating thousands of miles from any authority except his own required more than military efficiency. It demanded genuine care for the human beings whose loyalty made his achievements possible. His orders became more frequent but less harsh, his presence more visible throughout the fleet, and his attention to individual concerns more pronounced as he worked to maintain cohesion among men whose endurance was approaching its limits. The admiral's own internal struggles remained largely hidden from his subordinates, but they were nonetheless real and profound. The philosophical discussions he had engaged in from Ceylon to Zimbabwe had raised questions about the nature of imperial power and the responsibilities that accompanied its exercise. The wealth and sophistication he had encountered in distant kingdoms had challenged Chinese assumptions about cultural superiority that had shaped his own identity since childhood. Most personally troubling, the religious diversity he had navigated throughout the voyage had complicated his understanding of his own spiritual journey in ways that would influence the remainder of his life. As the treasure ships sailed through the Indian Ocean swells that would carry them back toward familiar waters, Zheng He stood at his flagship's bow contemplating achievements and challenges that would define not only his own legacy but the future of Chinese relations with the wider world. Behind him stretched waters that now carried permanent Chinese influence in the form of trading posts, diplomatic missions, and collaborative agreements that would shape regional politics for generations. Ahead lay the South China Sea and the Yangtze River, home waters that would welcome the return of the greatest naval expedition in human history. But the admiral understood, with the clarity that comes from seeing the world's true scope, that this voyage's end would mark not a conclusion, but a beginning. The Yongle Emperor's vision of Chinese authority extending across the known world had been largely realized, but that realization had revealed new possibilities and responsibilities that would require future expeditions, larger fleets, and more ambitious objectives. The treasure ships now sailing toward China carried not just the success of one remarkable voyage, but the foundation for a global empire whose implications could barely be imagined. The wind that filled their sails carried them eastward through waters that had witnessed the expansion of Chinese power beyond anything previously attempted, toward a homeland that would never again seem isolated from the broader currents of world history. The monsoon that caught them 3 days out from Ceylon arrived without warning. A wall of black clouds that rose from the southern horizon like a mountain range given motion, its advance marked by lightning that turned the afternoon sky purple and thunder that seemed to shake the ocean itself. The treasure ships, magnificent as they were, suddenly appeared fragile as insects before this display of natural power that dwarfed even the Yongle Emperor's ambitions. Zheng He had faced storms before, but never while commanding a fleet whose loss would represent the greatest maritime disaster in human history. 28,000 lives depended on decisions he would make in the next few hours, while the future of Chinese power in the Indian Ocean hung in the balance between seamanship and catastrophe. The wind that had carried them across 3 continents now turned enemy, its voice rising from whisper to shriek in minutes that felt like heartbeats in the life of a drowning man. The admiral's orders rang across the water with the clarity that comes from absolute authority exercised under ultimate pressure. The largest treasure ships would maintain formation and ride out the storm in deep water, their size and construction allowing them to survive swells that would destroy smaller vessels. The supply ships and troop transports would seek shelter among the coral atolls they had passed that morning, their shallow drafts permitting navigation through reefs that the treasure ships could not risk. The escort vessels would patrol between the separated elements, maintaining communication and providing assistance wherever the storm's fury exceeded human preparation. What followed was 36 hours that tested every assumption about Chinese naval superiority. The treasure ships, engineering marvels that had impressed every harbor from Malacca to Malindi, found themselves fighting for survival against forces that rendered human technology irrelevant. Waves 60 feet high swept across decks that normally rose 40 feet above sea level, while winds approaching hurricane strength turned rigging into weapons that could kill men who had survived 2 years of distant dangers only to die within sight of the Indian coast. Below decks, in compartments that had seemed spacious during calm weather, hundreds of men crowded into spaces that now felt like coffins waiting to be sealed. The exotic animals they carried: giraffes whose necks had been carefully braced for the voyage, zebras whose stripes seemed to blur in the artificial twilight of storm-battered ships, precious birds whose songs had entertained homesick sailors through long nights of ocean passage, huddled in terror that transcended species boundaries. The sound of their distress mixed with human prayers offered in a dozen languages to gods whose mercy seemed very distant from these heaving waters. The greatest treasure ship, Zheng He's flagship, that had served as the expedition's mobile palace for over 2 years, revealed the limits of even Chinese naval architecture. Its 9 masts, which had dominated every skyline from Hormuz to Ceylon, now bent like saplings in wind that seemed determined to reduce human ambitions to floating debris. The admiral himself, lashed to the highest observation platform that remained above the mountainous swells, watched his carefully organized fleet scattered across miles of tortured ocean while making calculations that would determine whether this voyage ended in triumph or tragedy. The storm's peak came near midnight of the second day, when wind and wave combined in displays of power that made every man aboard question his survival. The flagship's mainmast, a single tree that had grown for centuries in the mountains of southern China before being shaped into the centerpiece of imperial naval might, snapped with a sound like thunder that somehow carried above the gale's roar. Its fall cleared the deck of everything not permanently fixed, while its weight shifted the ship's balance in ways that threatened to roll them into the abyss that yawned with each passing swell. Zheng He's response to this crisis demonstrated why the Yongle Emperor had chosen him above every other commander in the Chinese military. Rather than retreat to the relative safety of the lower decks, he moved forward toward the point of maximum danger, his tall frame somehow maintaining balance on surfaces that tilted at angles no man should be able to negotiate. His voice, trained in the battles that had made Zhu Di emperor, cut through wind and wave to reach sailors whose terror was transforming into the kind of panic that destroys ships more efficiently than any storm. Working alongside men whose lives had become more precious to him than his own, the admiral supervised the desperate effort to clear the wreckage before it punched through the hull. Chinese naval architecture had anticipated battle damage, but not the complex stresses created when a ship's own rigging became a battering ram driven by wind that seemed personally vindictive. The work required coordination between crews who could barely see each other across a deck, awash with water that rose and fell like a living thing seeking to claim victims from those who dared to challenge its dominion. By dawn of the third day, the storm began to exhaust itself against the endurance of men who refused to surrender dreams that had carried them across 30,000 miles of ocean. The wind dropped from shriek to moan, then from moan to whisper, finally settling into the steady breathing of normal weather that allowed human voices to be heard without shouting. The swells remained mountainous, but their crests no longer broke with the violence that had threatened to crush even the treasure ships, while the clouds that had turned day into night began to separate enough to reveal patches of blue that seemed impossibly bright after the storm's darkness. The damage assessment revealed losses that would have crippled any expedition except one planned with Chinese thoroughness. 3 supply ships had been driven onto reefs and broken apart, their crews rescued by escort vessels whose captains had risked their own ships to save shipmates they had sailed with for over 2 years. 2 treasure ships had suffered mass damage that would require weeks of repairs using materials they no longer carried in sufficient quantities. Most seriously, their fresh water supplies had been contaminated by seawater that had found ways into storage systems designed to be watertight under any conceivable conditions. But the fleet had survived. 28,000 men who had awakened 3 days before to routine ocean passage now found themselves alive through a combination of Chinese engineering, seamanship that had been refined over centuries of dangerous navigation, and leadership that had refused to accept defeat even when survival seemed impossible. The giraffes still stood in their specially designed stalls, their calm eyes suggesting a dignity that transcended human understanding of disaster. The tribute and trade goods that filled the treasure ships' holds remained secure, while the maps and charts that recorded their unprecedented voyage had been protected in waterproof containers that had justified every ounce of their weight in silk and precious metals. More significantly, the storm had created bonds of shared experience that transcended the normal hierarchies of imperial expeditions. Officers and crew who had maintained careful distinctions of rank throughout the voyage now worked side by side on repairs that required every available hand regardless of social position. The Muslim sailors who formed the core of the fleet's navigation expertise found themselves respected by Confucian administrators whose cultural prejudices had been worn away by months of dependence on skills that could not be learned from books. Most remarkably, the foreign passengers who had joined the expedition in various ports, Ceylon monks, Malaccan interpreters, Arab merchants returning to China, were now treated as full members of the fleet whose survival mattered as much as any Chinese sailors. The repairs required 3 weeks in a sheltered bay on the Indian coast, time that Zheng He used to consolidate the lessons learned during their unprecedented voyage. His senior officers, men who had begun this expedition as provincial Chinese administrators, had been transformed into global strategic thinkers whose understanding of maritime power would influence imperial policy for generations. Their reports to Beijing would describe not just the kingdoms they had visited, but the complex relationships between geography, technology, and political authority that determined success or failure in the wider world. The admiral himself used these weeks of enforced delay for reflection that would shape his understanding of what they had accomplished and what it meant for China's future. The philosophical discussions he had engaged in from Ceylon to Zimbabwe had challenged assumptions about cultural superiority that had shaped Chinese foreign policy since the empire's founding. The technological innovations he had observed in distant kingdoms suggested that Chinese advantages, while substantial, were not insurmountable if other civilizations learned to combine their own strengths effectively. Most troubling were the questions raised by their diplomatic successes. The tributary relationships they had established from Malacca to Malindi represented unprecedented extensions of Chinese authority, but they also created responsibilities that would require permanent commitments of resources and attention. The Yongle Emperor's vision of Chinese supremacy over global trade routes was being realized, but that realization revealed obligations that might exceed even the Middle Kingdom's impressive capabilities. The return voyage to China proceeded through waters that now seemed familiar despite their continued dangers. The South China Sea, which had appeared vast and mysterious during their outward passage, now felt almost intimate after the oceanic expanses they had crossed. The islands of Southeast Asia, which had once represented exotic frontiers of Chinese knowledge, now served as familiar waypoints whose rulers greeted them as returning friends rather than foreign conquerors. At Malacca, Sultan Paramaswara welcomed them with ceremonies that celebrated not just their return but their survival of challenges that had tested the limits of human endurance. The tribute and gifts he presented reflected 2 years of prosperity generated by his alliance with China, while his requests for continued protection demonstrated the permanent nature of relationships they had created. The Sultanate had become genuinely Chinese in its orientation, its policies shaped more by Beijing's interests than by traditional Southeast Asian concerns. The approach to Chinese waters created emotions among the crew that transcended simple homecoming. These men had departed as representatives of the Middle Kingdom's power, but they returned as witnesses to a world whose scope and complexity had forever changed their understanding of their homeland's place in human civilization. The familiar landmarks of the South China Sea, islands whose names they had learned as children, fishing villages where their own families might have originated, now seemed both precious and provincial after harbors that had hosted ships from 3 continents. The Yangtze River, when it finally appeared through the morning mist, represented more than geographical homecoming. This was the waterway that had launched their unprecedented voyage, the route that connected China's heartland to the ocean highways they had claimed for imperial commerce. The sight of its muddy waters, so different from the crystalline blues and greens of tropical seas, brought tears to men who had maintained discipline through storms that should have killed them, but who broke down at the simple sight of home. The reception that awaited them at Nanjing surpassed even Chinese standards for imperial ceremony. The Yongle Emperor himself, the man whose vision had launched the greatest naval expedition in human history, waited at the river's edge to welcome back the admiral who had exceeded every expectation. The crowds that lined the waterfront had gathered not just to celebrate military success, but to witness the return of men who had pushed the boundaries of the possible and lived to describe worlds that existed beyond Chinese imagination. The parade of treasure ships up the Yangtze became a procession that seemed designed by poets rather than naval administrators. The surviving vessels, their hulls bearing scars from 2 years of ocean service, moved in formation past crowds whose amazement exceeded anything they had experienced in foreign ports. The exotic animals visible on the ship's decks, giraffes whose necks rose above even the tallest masts, zebras whose stripes seemed painted by celestial artists, creatures whose very existence challenged established understanding of natural law, created wonder that would be talked about for generations. But the most significant cargo was invisible to the cheering crowds. The knowledge and experience carried in the minds of 28,000 men who had witnessed the true scope of human civilization would influence Chinese policy and culture in ways that could barely be imagined. Their reports would fill libraries, their navigational data would guide future expeditions, and their diplomatic achievements would reshape relationships between China and the world for centuries to come. The formal presentation of the expedition's results to the imperial court revealed achievements that exceeded the Yongle Emperor's most ambitious objectives. Tribute from kingdoms spanning 3 continents filled warehouses with goods that demonstrated Chinese authority over trade routes of unprecedented scope. Maps and charts corrected geographical misconceptions that had shaped strategic thinking for generations, while intelligence reports provided detailed assessments of foreign military capabilities and political vulnerabilities that would inform imperial decision-making throughout the dynasty. The live animals presented to the emperor became symbols of Chinese reach that inspired artists, poets, and philosophers whose works would celebrate the treasure fleet's achievements for centuries. The giraffe that had survived the voyage from East Africa was declared a Qilin, a mythical creature whose appearance traditionally signaled heaven's approval of imperial rule. Its presence in the Forbidden City became proof that the mandate of heaven extended to the very edges of the known world, validating the Yongle Emperor's claim to universal authority in ways that no military victory could equal. The permanent missions established throughout their voyage began sending regular reports that transformed Chinese understanding of global political and economic conditions. From Malacca to Malindi, Chinese representatives monitored trade flows, political developments, and technological innovations that might affect imperial interests. The intelligence network they created would influence Chinese foreign policy for decades, providing information that allowed Beijing to anticipate and respond to international developments with unprecedented sophistication. But the treasure fleet's greatest achievement was intangible. the transformation of China from a regional power to a genuinely global empire, whose influence extended across 3 continents. The tributary relationships established during their voyage created a commercial and diplomatic network that acknowledged Chinese supremacy while generating wealth and intelligence that enhanced imperial capabilities in ways that would outlast any individual emperor or dynasty. Zheng He himself received honors that reflected his unprecedented achievements. The Yongle Emperor elevated him to the highest ranks of imperial nobility, while granting him estates and privileges that made him one of the wealthiest men in China. More significantly, he was appointed to command future treasure fleet expeditions that would maintain and expand Chinese authority throughout the regions he had opened to imperial influence. Yet the admiral's private reflections, recorded in journals that would not survive the political upheavals that followed the Yongle Emperor's death, revealed concerns that contradicted the official celebrations. The costs of maintaining Chinese authority over such vast distances would eventually exceed even the Middle Kingdom's impressive resources. The civilizations they had encountered possessed their own ambitions and capabilities that might eventually challenge Chinese supremacy if they learned to coordinate their efforts effectively. Most troubling, the philosophical and religious questions raised by their encounters with diverse cultures had begun undermining the Confucian certainties that provided intellectual foundations for imperial authority. These concerns proved prophetic. The Yongle Emperor's death in 1424 brought to power successors whose priorities differed dramatically from his global vision. The costs of maintaining the treasure fleets, combined with military pressures along China's northern borders, led to policy reversals that would abandon the oceanic empire Zheng He had created. Future emperors would turn inward, focusing on continental concerns, while allowing Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean to atrophy through neglect and indifference. The final treasure fleet expedition departed China in 1433, its objectives more limited than those of the great voyages that had established Chinese global authority. Zheng He, now in his 60s but still commanding the respect that came from unmatched achievements, led this last expedition with the understanding that it represented the end rather than the continuation of Chinese maritime expansion. The diplomatic relationships he had created would be maintained but not extended. The trade networks he had established would continue operating but without imperial support, and the strategic positions he had secured would gradually be abandoned as China's attention turned toward other priorities. The admiral's death during this final voyage, probably at Calicut in the harbor where he had negotiated China's first Indian alliance nearly 3 decades before, marked the end of an era in world history. His body was buried at sea according to Islamic tradition, his grave unmarked except by the waters he had navigated with unequaled skill and vision. The men who served under him returned to China with reports that would be filed away and gradually forgotten as the empire that had created the treasure fleets turned its attention toward other concerns. Within a generation, the greatest naval expeditions in human history had been deliberately erased from official Chinese memory. The Confucian scholars, who dominated imperial administration, viewed the treasure fleets as expensive adventures that had diverted resources from more important priorities. The detailed records of their achievements were suppressed or destroyed, while the maps and charts that had guided Chinese navigation across 3 continents were locked away in imperial archives where they would remain unused for centuries. The consequences of this abandonment would reshape world history in ways that Chinese policymakers could not anticipate. The Indian Ocean trade routes that Zheng He had secured for Chinese commerce would gradually be taken over by Portuguese, Dutch, and British expeditions whose technological capabilities were inferior to those of the treasure fleets, but whose persistence ultimately proved more valuable than temporary superiority. The diplomatic relationships that had acknowledged Chinese supremacy would atrophy as European powers filled the vacuum created by imperial withdrawal, establishing their own colonial empires on foundations that Chinese expeditions had helped create. Yet the memory of the treasure fleet survived in the places they had visited, preserved in local traditions that celebrated the brief period when Chinese ships had dominated the world's oceans. From Malacca to Malindi, stories passed down through generations described the great admiral who had brought floating palaces to trade with their ancestors, whose gifts had included creatures that seemed borrowed from paradise, whose departure had marked the end of an age when the seas belonged to the Middle Kingdom rather than to the pale-skinned barbarians who would follow. In China itself, the treasure fleets became legends that survived despite official suppression. Sailors told stories of Zheng He's achievements in the harbors where his ships had once been built, while merchants recalled the prosperity that had flowed from trade routes he had opened to Chinese commerce. The maps he had created, though hidden in imperial archives, were occasionally consulted by later navigators whose own expeditions never matched the scope and ambition of the treasure fleets. Most remarkably, the Islamic communities of Western China preserved memories of their most famous son, the Muslim eunuch who had carried their faith to the edges of the known world while serving an infidel emperor with loyalty that transcended religious boundaries. The rediscovery of the treasure fleets by modern historians has revealed one of the great turning points in world history, the moment when human civilization's center of gravity shifted from Asia to Europe not through European achievement, but through Chinese abandonment. Had the Ming dynasty continued supporting oceanic expansion with the same resources and determination that created Zheng He's expeditions, the age of exploration would have been dominated by Chinese rather than European powers. The colonial empires that shaped the modern world would have been Asian rather than Western, while the scientific and technological advantages that enabled European dominance would have developed within Chinese rather than European contexts. But history admits no hypothetical alternatives. The treasure fleets sailed when they sailed, achieved what they achieved, and disappeared when political priorities changed, and imperial resources were redirected toward other objectives. Their legacy exists not in the empire they might have created, but in the demonstration they provided of what human ambition could accomplish when supported by technological sophistication, organizational capability, and leadership that refused to accept limitations others considered absolute. Zheng He himself remains one of history's most remarkable figures, a man who lost everything as a child, yet gained power beyond most men's dreams, whose faith transcended the boundaries that separated civilizations, whose achievements opened seas that had never known Chinese authority and created relationships that outlasted the empire that made them possible. His story demonstrates the complex interactions between individual capability and historical circumstance that determine whether human potential is realized or abandoned to the accidents of political change. The waters he navigated with such skill still carry the ships of nations whose maritime traditions began with his example. The ports he visited still bear traces of Chinese influence planted during voyages that extended the Middle Kingdom's reach across 3 continents. The diplomatic principles he pioneered, respect for local customs combined with insistence on imperial supremacy, commercial cooperation balanced with military superiority, continue influencing international relations in ways that connect the modern world to the age when treasure fleets carried Chinese authority to the very edges of human knowledge. Standing today on the Bund in Shanghai, watching container ships from every nation loading cargo that will travel trade routes first mapped by Chinese navigators 6 centuries ago, it is possible to glimpse the world that might have been if the treasure fleets had continued sailing. The global economy that connects continents through networks of commerce and communication realizes, in ways their creators never imagined, the vision that sent Zheng He's armadas across oceans that belonged briefly to the Middle Kingdom and permanently to the human imagination's capacity for greatness. The wind that fills modern sails still carries whispers of the greatest naval expeditions in human history. Voyages that proved distance meant nothing to properly organized ambition, that demonstrated cooperation could achieve more than conquest, and that showed the world belonged not to any single civilization, but to the human species whose representatives had the courage to sail beyond familiar horizons toward destinations that existed only in dreams bold enough to become reality. If you enjoyed learning about this remarkable chapter in maritime history, please consider subscribing to Michael's Expeditions for more stories of human courage and exploration that changed our understanding of what was possible. And let me know in the comments, what aspect of Zheng He's incredible voyages surprised you most? These stories of exploration and discovery deserve to be remembered and celebrated.